The lecture hall buzzed with the low hum of expectation, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead as students shuffled in, murmuring among themselves. The scent of chalk dust mingled with the faint tang of worn carpet, the kind of smell that seemed to absorb the anticipation of a room filled with young minds. At the front of the hall, Professor Cassandra Lorraine moved with deliberate precision, each step measured, each motion exact. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished wood floor, a metronome of authority. Dark navy tailored suit, silk blouse, hair pinned perfectly, she was a vision of composure and control, the embodiment of brilliance disciplined into perfection. Her reputation preceded her, whispers of her papers, her awards, her ruthless critique of students and colleagues alike, wove through the crowd like a nervous undercurrent. To sit under her gaze was to feel both awe and a subtle, unspoken fear. Cassandra's eyes scanned the lecture hall with icy scrutiny, adjusting the projector, tapping chalk against the board, measuring the angle of every light shadowed by her precise hand. The students straightened, sensing the weight of expectation pressing down on them before she even spoke. She picked up a piece of white chalk and began to write, a symbol here, a sum there, a cascade of derivatives and integrals stretching across the blackboard panels like a map of a world few dared to enter. The equation seemed endless, weaving together elements of topology, abstract algebra, and differential geometry in a way that almost appeared mischievous, as if taunting anyone who thought they could follow its logic. Her handwriting, meticulous and exact, left no room for error. She paused at the end, brushed her hands against the chalk-dusted board, and turned slowly to face the students, a faint smirk curling at the corner of her lips. "Anyone who can solve this," she said, her voice smooth, mocking, yet carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt, "I'll marry them on the spot." The words hung in the air, absurd, cruelly playful. A few students tittered nervously, unsure whether laughter was appropriate, while others simply stared, frozen between disbelief and awe. The room's atmosphere became taut, like a string drawn to its limit, every eye flicking between the symbols on the board and the woman who dared issue such a challenge. Near the rear door, Thomas Keene's mop squeaked lightly against the linoleum as he paused, head tilted, eyes narrowing. He had entered the lecture hall earlier, sweeping the edges of the room, cleaning absent-mindedly, but now he found himself staring at the cascade of symbols. The familiarity of the patterns, the faint echo of years of obsessive study, pricked at something long dormant within him. Under his breath, barely audible, he muttered, Riemann tensor, compact form. The words, soft and almost reverent, caught Cassandra's sharp attention. Her head snapped toward him, eyes flashing like steel. "Excuse me," she demanded, voice slicing through the murmurs. Thomas froze, gripping the mop handle, realizing too late that he had spoken aloud. His pulse quickened, not from fear alone, but from the surge of old ambition, the first flickers of the genius he had buried years ago under grief and sacrifice. Cassandra's smirk faltered slightly, an almost imperceptible twitch betraying the slightest bruising of her ego. A janitor correcting a professor in her own hall? Preposterous, yet something in the timbre of his words hinted at a knowledge she had not anticipated. She straightened, suppressing the ripple of irritation, masking it with the usual veneer of indifference, though her mind was already spinning, calculating, wondering just how dangerous this quiet man could be. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor of excitement that had not touched him in half a decade. For the first time since his mother's death and his retreat from the world of mathematics, he allowed himself to imagine the possibility that he was not just a shadow in these halls, a man condemned to invisibility, but something else entirely. The spark had returned. And in the corner of her mind, Cassandra Lorraine noted the disturbance in her carefully controlled universe, a ripple she would not yet allow herself to fully understand. Thomas left the lecture hall slowly, his mop squeaking against the worn floor like a hesitant heartbeat. He didn't look back, though every instinct screamed to watch Cassandra Lorraine, the untouchable queen of equations, react to his quiet interjection. The students had returned to murmurs, but their whispers seemed faint, as if the room itself had absorbed something larger, something unspoken. Thomas's mind, once trained for brilliance, now roamed cautiously through shadowed corridors of memory. Years ago, this room would have been his stage, his sanctuary. Now it was a theater of ghosts, his mother's warnings, his lost accolades, the faces of colleagues who had once revered him and now could not find him. Cassandra returned to her blackboards, her chalk poised like a scalpel in the hands of a master surgeon. She didn't speak at first. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing, as if attempting to dissect what had just occurred in that brief moment of disruption. How dare a janitor, a faceless presence in her meticulously curated world, mutter the correct terminology under his breath? The thought prickled her pride, the icy veneer she had honed over decades. Pride, yes, but also something unfamiliar, unease. That unease spread like ink in water, tangling with her confidence, challenging the assumption that she could control every narrative, every outcome, every mind that dared enter her lecture hall. Meanwhile, Thomas descended the staircase to the basement corridors, the scent of industrial cleaner and wet concrete grounding him in the reality of the present, though every echo of the chalkboard reverberated like a summons from the past. He thought of his mother, long gone, her fragile hand pressing against his shoulder, whispering, "Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of your gift." Those words had been buried under grief, debt, and quiet resignation. Yet tonight, they sparked again, fragile but undeniable. For the first time in 5 years, Thomas felt the old fire rekindling, not for recognition, not for glory, but for the pure, untainted joy of solving a problem that was, in its cruel perfection, designed to be unsolvable. Back in her office, Cassandra tapped her pen against her desk, staring at a stack of her own papers, annotations meticulous but lacking vitality. She had spent decades building walls of logic and prestige, yet tonight, the world felt slightly off-kilter, destabilized by a single, fleeting interjection. A janitor, a man invisible to her world, had pierced the armor of her intellectual dominion with a whisper. Her pulse quickened. The thought refused to leave her: what if he actually knows more than he should? Across campus, Thomas retrieved a worn notebook from the bottom shelf of a neglected janitorial closet. It was filled with cryptic scribbles, unfinished proofs, and half-remembered formulas, a diary of brilliance abandoned too soon. He flipped through the pages slowly, reverently, feeling the texture of the paper under his fingers like a lifeline to a life he had buried. The equation Cassandra had written was unlike anything he had seen before in decades, a labyrinth of interwoven principles, subtle enough to trap even the most vigilant minds. Yet beneath its terrifying complexity, Thomas could sense a pattern, a heartbeat within the symbols that beckoned him to follow. Every creak of the hall above, every flicker of fluorescent light, heightened the tension. He knew Cassandra would be watching, somewhere in the shadows of her office or roaming the corridors, her presence a silent predator assessing the landscape. The knowledge that someone was anticipating his every move, waiting to see if he would succeed or fail, sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. It had been years since he had felt anything like this, the thrill, the terror, the intoxicating dance of intellect and risk. For Cassandra, the evening stretched long into the night. She paced in her office, mind looping through permutations, checking derivations, muttering corrections under her breath, but every calculation felt hollow. The gnawing suspicion that Thomas might actually solve her puzzle, that her control over this classroom, her domain, her identity, might be challenged, refused to leave her. Each tick of the clock was a drumbeat of suspense, each shadow along the walls a reminder that brilliance sometimes walks in the most unexpected forms. Thomas paused in the dim glow of the library's after-hours lights. Chalk in hand, a borrowed board set before him, he felt the first real taste of purpose in half a decade. The room was silent, the universe holding its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, a smile tugged at his lips. Not for victory, not yet, but for the sheer inevitability of what was about to unfold. Somewhere, a janitor would solve an impossible equation and, in doing so, awaken the world that had once ignored him. Somewhere, a professor's cold dominion would tremble, and a story would begin that no one in that lecture hall would forget. The library at Northwestern at night was a cathedral of silence. Rows of books towered like stone pillars, shelves heavy with the weight of human thought and imagination. Thomas moved between them with deliberate reverence, a man stepping back into a world that had once been entirely his. Every volume was a key, every page a reminder that he had once been someone who could command the very logic of the universe with nothing but a pencil and a mind that saw patterns others could not. He pulled a chair to a secluded table, clearing a space for notebooks, scraps of paper, and a dusty chalkboard borrowed from the storage closet. He traced the symbols Cassandra had written in his mind before touching the chalk to the board. The equation was not merely a collection of abstract symbols, it was a gauntlet, a monument to intellect designed to crush anyone foolish enough to try. And yet, buried in its impossible complexity, he recognized a rhythm, an echo of his own old work. His fingers trembled slightly as he began to write, the chalk whispering against the board, each mark a tentative heartbeat. Across campus, Cassandra could feel the disturbance before she saw it. Her office felt suddenly too quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights too sharp. She replayed the moment of Thomas's whisper in her mind, the faint inflection that suggested knowledge beyond his role, beyond the social space he occupied. The thought burrowed like a worm into her consciousness. Could it be possible? Could someone like him, someone invisible, actually comprehend this? By midnight, Thomas was deep in the mathematics, moving fluidly between quantum tensors, differential manifolds, and topological constructs. Sweat beaded on his brow, not from exertion alone, but from the thrill of reclaiming something lost. Each solution he wrote, each manipulation he executed, was a silent rebellion against the years of grief, anonymity, and self-imposed exile. He knew Cassandra was watching in some corner, somewhere in her mind, if not in person. And he welcomed it. The presence of a rival, a master of her domain, sharpened his thinking, pulled him closer to the brilliance he had buried beneath sorrow. Meanwhile, Cassandra's nights became a mirror of his. The lecture hall haunted her, the students' nervous laughter echoed in her skull, rebounding off the walls like a cruel metronome. Every calculation she attempted felt brittle, brittle against the shadow she could not shake, the shadow of Thomas Keene. Her pulse quickened in a way she had not allowed herself in decades. She walked the halls after hours, checking seminar rooms, scanning unused blackboards, searching for evidence that the whispers in her mind were real. She found it one night in an abandoned classroom 2 corridors from her office, the faint traces of chalk, partially erased, the strokes confident yet hesitant in places that suggested the hand of a master reconnecting with a long-forgotten instrument. Cassandra froze, breath caught in her chest, staring at the curves, the transformations, the subtle maneuvers that no student, or even a junior professor, could execute. The handwriting was neat but not practiced in the way of a current academic, it was a hand remembering its own power. Her mind raced. She understood instantly the implications. The janitor had not only recognized her error in the lecture hall, he was dismantling her equation piece by piece, rebuilding it in ways she hadn't imagined. The next morning, whispers buzzed through the faculty corridors. "Have you seen him? The janitor, working at midnight?" Students began speculating wildly, a genius undercover, a visiting savant, perhaps even a former faculty member driven mad by curiosity. Cassandra found herself obsessed. She arrived at the lecture hall hours early, checking the boards, rehearsing solutions, and reviewing every derivation in her office as if she could will herself ahead of him. Each night, she lingered near the abandoned seminar room, pretending to sort papers or prepare lectures, watching, waiting. Her pride demanded that she be first, that no one, even Thomas, undermine the authority she had built her life around. Yet a part of her, buried beneath the layers of ambition and control, felt something she could neither name nor suppress, fear. And Thomas, still cloaked in anonymity, still a janitor in title alone, continued to write, erase, and rewrite. Each night he inched closer to the solution, driven not by promise or recognition, but by the intoxicating pull of intellect, the quiet ache of being seen, and the faint, undeniable thrill that somewhere in the shadows, someone was paying attention. With each step, he felt the old power return, fluid, unstoppable, like water cutting through stone. The tension between them grew invisible yet tangible, a taut wire spanning the university halls. Cassandra's obsession and Thomas's quiet determination were moving toward inevitable collision, each step, each calculation, ratcheting suspense higher, the air itself pregnant with the knowledge that something extraordinary was about to unfold. And in that silence, in that slow dance of minds separated by title but united by intellect, the first tremors of what would become a reckoning began to pulse through the building. Neither could know how the next week would transform them both, or how a single impossible equation would ignite a confrontation that would shatter pride, expose vulnerability, and redefine what it meant to be truly brilliant. The nights grew colder as December crept across the campus, frost painting the edges of windows and stiffening the air like a warning. Thomas Keene moved silently through the labyrinth of corridors, his mop pushed aside, untouched for the first time in years. The abandoned seminar room had become his sanctuary, a place where he could return to the language that had once defined him. Each night he entered, the chalkboard awaited like a blank canvas for a mind both brilliant and exiled. The equation Cassandra Lorraine had written loomed across 3 panels like a fortress of logic and complexity, designed to crush anyone who dared to scale it. And yet, Thomas saw it differently, not as a trap, but as a challenge, a conversation written in symbols, daring him to speak back. Every movement of his hand, every stroke of chalk, was deliberate yet fluid, the rhythm returning naturally, like a violinist reclaiming muscle memory after years of silence. He felt the familiar adrenaline that had once made him untouchable in academic circles, but now it was tempered by restraint. Each night he allowed himself to solve only a fraction, teasing the problem, testing the limits of his own mind, leaving room for more in the next session. It was a game of patience, of anticipation, but also, he realized, a way to measure the distance he had traveled from the prodigy who had left Yale 5 years ago. Cassandra, meanwhile, had become a specter in her own lecture hall. Her mornings were devoted to teaching, her afternoons to administrative obligations, but her nights belonged to obsession. She patrolled the university as if it were a chessboard, each classroom and hallway a square to be controlled. Every sound, a muffled footstep, a squeak of a cart, a distant echo of chalk against board, set her nerves alight. Her mind churned in endless permutations, recalculating the equation in every possible form, anticipating errors, imagining shortcuts, all in the desperate hope of staying ahead. Pride gnawed at her, but beneath it, something more primal, fear. The fear that the invisible man who swept her floors might not only match her intellect, but surpass it. One night, she lingered outside the seminar room, pretending to retrieve old lecture notes from a forgotten shelf. Through the narrow window, she caught sight of Thomas hunched over the chalkboard. His posture was familiar, his motions confident, yet slightly hesitant in places, small signs of a mind reconnecting with dormant genius. She watched, captivated and disoriented, as he traced lines and curves that made her pulse quicken. Every stroke seemed alive, every symbol a sentence in a story she no longer controlled. Her breath hitched. She wanted to intervene, to assert authority, to reclaim her dominion, but another part of her, buried beneath years of discipline and pride, recoiled in awe. Thomas paused mid-derivation, chalk hovering, as if feeling her gaze from across the corridor. For a moment, their connection was unspoken, a current stronger than words. He knew she was watching. He could feel the tension, the expectation, the ego quietly warping in the shadows. And yet, he did not stop. Not for her, not for anyone. He wrote, erased, and wrote again, each line a testament to both his mastery and restraint, each formula a whisper of identity rediscovered. The suspense escalated with every passing night. Rumors began circulating among students who wandered the halls late or lingered in the library, tales of a janitor who solved equations faster than graduate students, who moved with the precision of someone decades ahead of his time. Some whispered that he was a visiting genius, a recluse, perhaps even a ghost haunting the mathematics department. Cassandra's curiosity turned to obsession. Every cell in her body screamed to know his mind, to see the proof unfold. She could not sleep, could not eat properly, could not focus on her own work. The first confrontation loomed silently. Cassandra realized, with an unsettling clarity, that Thomas Keene was no ordinary janitor. This was a man who had once commanded the highest echelons of mathematical brilliance, who had walked away from it, and now returned not in triumph, but in shadow. Every instinct screamed that the collision of their intellects would shatter more than pride, it would unravel the carefully constructed identities they each had spent decades perfecting. And so, night after night, the game continued, a silent duel played with chalk and paper, shadows and glances. Thomas solved fragments, Cassandra obsessed over anticipation, both teetering on the edge of revelation. The air between them, though unspoken, crackled with the electricity of suspense, a storm gathering in a seemingly ordinary university, a reckoning waiting just beyond the next stroke of chalk, the next erased line, the next calculated move. By the end of one particularly frigid evening, Thomas stepped back from the board, tracing the outlines of a solution that could only be described as elegant, daring, almost arrogant in its precision. He wiped his hands, leaving faint traces of chalk dust like fingerprints of genius, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Somewhere in the building, Cassandra felt the tremor, a subtle shift in the balance of power. She would not yet see the full solution, but she knew, instinctively, that the impossible had already begun to bend beneath his hand. The week had passed in a blur of frostbitten mornings and moonless nights, the kind of nights where even the campus air seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Keene moved like a shadow, unseen but omnipresent, threading the university halls with quiet purpose. The abandoned seminar room had become a crucible. Chalk dust coated his hands, papers littered the floor, and formulas sprawled across the blackboard like the map of an unexplored universe. He was close, closer than he had allowed himself to feel in years, but the solution was not merely an answer. It was a reclamation of a self long buried, a whisper of brilliance he had been forced to bury under grief and anonymity. Cassandra Lorraine's obsession had reached a fever pitch. She had begun arriving at the seminar room before Thomas even appeared, lingering in shadows with notebooks clutched to her chest, pretending to study old theorems while her mind raced through every possible derivation. Pride demanded she confront him, that she assert authority, but another force, fear, curiosity, something dangerously like awe, kept her silent, just outside the door. She watched as the janitor, the invisible man, moved with an elegance she had never fully encountered. Each stroke of chalk was deliberate, confident, almost musical in its rhythm. Her pulse quickened. Her mind, trained for decades in control and precision, felt both exhilarated and violated. Thomas paused mid-calculation, chalk suspended in air, sensing her gaze. For a heartbeat, they were tethered across the room by something older, something ineffable, recognition. She saw him fully, not as a janitor, not as an intruder, but as a mind that mirrored her own in intelligence, ambition, and hidden vulnerability. And he saw her, a brilliance wrapped in steel, a fear she refused to acknowledge. Their connection was electric, silent, impossible to ignore. The tension snapped one night when a stray student wandered too close, curious about the rumors of the janitor who solved the impossible. The sound of the door opening sent both Thomas and Cassandra spinning. He instinctively erased the small section of the board he had been refining, she instinctively stepped forward, eyes blazing. The student froze, gawking at the two figures locked in silent confrontation. "You shouldn't be here," Cassandra hissed, her voice low, dangerous. Thomas didn't flinch. "And yet, I am," he said quietly, a hint of steel beneath the calm. "This is where I work. This is where I solve." For the first time, Cassandra's voice faltered. Pride clashed with curiosity, fear tangled with fascination. "You think you can finish it? Solve my equation?" After years of, she trailed off, unable to name the truth, the years he had been gone, the brilliance he had abandoned, the threat he posed not only to her equation but to the carefully constructed order of her world. "I've already begun," Thomas replied, chalk moving in deliberate arcs and angles. "And I will finish. But not for you. Not for recognition. Not for applause. I do this because it belongs to me, and because it's the first time in years I've felt alive." Cassandra's eyes narrowed, not in contempt, but in understanding. She had built walls around herself with logic, authority, and fear of imperfection. And now, in the presence of a man who had walked away from everything, those walls trembled. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken questions. Who were they beneath the roles they had inhabited? What did it mean to be truly seen, truly challenged, truly human? The following nights became a silent duel. Thomas wrote, erased, reimagined, each solution unfolding with breathtaking elegance. Cassandra obsessed, poring over her own calculations, attempting to anticipate his moves, desperate not to be outshone. Their rhythms intertwined like two dancers circling the same floor, each step a challenge, each pause a question. On the fifth night, Thomas executed a particularly audacious transformation, one that caused Cassandra to gasp softly as she realized the depth of his approach. The equation, her creation, her fortress, was bending under his intellect. Pride screamed to intervene, but awe rooted her to the doorway. He looked up, chalk poised, and their eyes met. No words were necessary. The tension that had been building for a week hung between them like storm clouds, dense with electricity, unspoken admiration, and the silent acknowledgement of something more than competition. For the first time, Cassandra felt fear, not the fear of failure, but the fear of being unmasked. Her carefully maintained identity of cold brilliance was no longer sufficient. Thomas had returned, not merely to solve a problem, but to expose the vulnerability she had buried beneath accolades and authority. Thomas set the chalk down for a moment, breathing deeply. Tomorrow, he said quietly, almost to himself, this ends. And in that whispered sentence, the promise of revelation, and the impending confrontation, hung like a knife poised over a delicate thread, ready to sever the fragile balance of intellect, ego, and humanity they both had so carefully constructed. The morning of the public confrontation dawned gray and brittle, the kind of November light that seemed to seep through stone and steel, laying the campus in a cold, unforgiving clarity. Students arrived in clusters, whispering, phones already poised, their excitement a low hum that vibrated through the hallways like distant thunder. Faculty gathered in the lecture hall with the same mixture of curiosity and dread, aware that what was about to unfold was unprecedented, that the carefully curated order of the university might fracture in the presence of an anomaly they had underestimated for far too long. Thomas Keene arrived quietly, janitor's uniform exchanged for a plain black suit, yet every step he took resonated with the latent authority of someone who had once held the world of mathematics in his hands. The room fell into a hush the moment he entered. He carried no arrogance, no performative flourish, only a quiet intensity, a man who had returned to claim something that had never truly left him. Cassandra Lorraine stood at the podium, her designer ensemble replaced with something more subdued, yet the tension coiled in her posture betrayed the internal storm. For the first time in decades, she felt not in control, not untouchable. She had designed an equation meant to humiliate, to assert her dominance, and now, the invisible challenger who swept her floors threatened not just to solve it, but to upend everything she had meticulously constructed. The blackboard stretched across 3 panels, the labyrinthine equation sprawling like a city of logic and abstraction. Cassandra's sharp eyes scanned every symbol, every subtle manipulation she had placed to mislead, to test the audacity of any solver. She knew every trick, every potential pitfall. And yet, standing at the edge of the room, she felt an unfamiliar weight of vulnerability press against her chest. Thomas stepped forward, chalk in hand. He paused, letting the tension stretch, letting the hundreds of eyes in the lecture hall imprint upon him the enormity of what was about to happen. Then, with a quiet inhalation, he began. The chalk scratched the board in a rhythm both deliberate and fluid, lines of logic and imagination intertwining with a precision that made some professors lean forward, adjusting glasses, muttering in disbelief. He moved with the certainty of a mind reclaiming lost dominion, each transformation a statement, each derivation an act of defiance against years of self-imposed invisibility. The audience watched, rapt and silent, the only sound the ghostly hiss of chalk against blackboard and the occasional soft exhale. Cassandra stood frozen, watching him navigate the maze she had constructed. Every subtle nuance, every elegant leap he made, revealed not only the solution, but the depth of his intellect, the grace of a mind that had never truly been broken, merely paused. Pride, fear, and awe collided violently within her, leaving her breathless, her hands clutching the podium as though it were the only anchor to reality. 40 minutes passed. An hour. And still, Thomas continued, unstoppable, resolute. His chalk traced arcs and angles, danced across differential manifolds, and threaded through tensors with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. Each step was a declaration. He was no longer the invisible man, the janitor, the shadow of what he had once been. He was Thomas Keene, mathematician, human, prodigy reborn. And then, finally, he paused. The boards were filled, solutions sprawled across 5 panels, neat, precise, breathtaking in their elegance. Silence fell, absolute, a weight that pressed down on every person in the room. Cassandra's chest heaved, not from exertion but from the shocking confrontation with the truth. She had been bested. The equation that had been her fortress, her assertion of superiority, lay conquered, not by a peer or rival, but by the man she had dismissed as beneath notice. The first faculty member to speak was Professor Harrison, his voice trembling with awe. This is not just correct. It's brilliant. Publishable brilliance. Murmurs erupted across the hall, a mixture of disbelief and admiration, but Cassandra's gaze remained fixed on Thomas. She saw not triumph in his eyes, but calm, sadness, and the quiet assertion of identity reclaimed. Thomas set the chalk down and met her eyes. "I didn't solve this for recognition," he said quietly, the weight of years of exile and grief underlying every word. "I solved it because for 5 years, I have been invisible. Not just here, but to myself. And for the first time, I am seen, not as a janitor, not as a shadow, but as a human, as a mathematician." The room seemed to shrink around them. Students and faculty held their breath as Cassandra, for the first time in her career, faced the reflection of her own hubris. She realized that her mockery, her cruel challenge, had been a mask for fear, a weapon forged from the absence of humanity. And now, she was confronted with someone who had risen above grief, above obscurity, and reminded her of a truth she had almost forgotten: brilliance without empathy is hollow, empty, cold light that illuminates nothing that matters. The first wave of applause was hesitant, almost reverent, but it grew, cascading into a roar that filled the lecture hall, echoing through corridors like the tolling of a bell. Yet amidst the noise, Cassandra felt something unfamiliar, something she could not name, a fracture in the walls she had built, a spark of admiration, respect, and, she dared not yet acknowledge, something dangerously close to awe. Thomas turned, chalk-stained fingers relaxed, eyes steady, and left the board behind, a monument to intellect, resilience, and the human spirit, leaving Cassandra frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed world irrevocably changed. The air in the lecture hall was thick with disbelief and awe, the kind that makes time feel suspended. Thomas Keene's solution sprawled across 5 blackboards like a monument to a mind that had once been lost, then found. Students leaned forward in stunned silence, their phones forgotten in trembling hands. Faculty whispered among themselves, adjusting glasses and muttering names of journals and papers he had referenced, names that confirmed the impossible. He had not only solved Cassandra Lorraine's equation, he had transformed it, elevated it to something far beyond her imagining. Cassandra stood at the podium, the color drained from her face, her usual armor of arrogance and icy control shattered. She had expected the embarrassment of a public failure to be hers, the triumphant humiliation of a janitor, a figure she had dismissed without a second thought, to reinforce the hierarchy she had so carefully curated. Instead, the impossible had become reality. The ghost she had overlooked, the man she had ridiculed, had proven something she had long forgotten: intellect and humanity are inseparable forces, and brilliance without compassion is a hollow flame. Thomas stepped back, his chalk-stained hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the gravity of what he had accomplished. The silence in the hall was absolute, waiting for some acknowledgement, some recognition of what had just occurred. He let it linger, letting everyone feel the weight of the truth: he was no longer invisible. Then he spoke, quiet but commanding. "I did not solve this for accolades. I did not solve this to prove superiority. I solved this because for 5 years I have been invisible. Not here, not anywhere. I left a world I loved because it could not save the one I loved most. And in hiding, I became someone I no longer recognized. Tonight, I reclaim not just mathematics, but myself. The room exhaled as if the words themselves had broken a spell. Cassandra's hands clenched at the podium, nails digging into polished wood. She wanted to speak, to assert, to reclaim some measure of control, but she could not. What was left for her to claim when everything she had used to define power and intellect had been dismantled in 30 minutes of fluid chalkwork by the man she had underestimated? One of the senior professors, Harrison, stood slowly, his voice trembling but steady. This is more than correctness. It's art. It's a masterwork. Publishable in any top journal. The methods, the insight, it's beyond what we thought possible. A ripple of realization ran through the room. Thomas had not only solved the problem, he had redefined it. The whispers spread faster than any lecture could have reached them. The janitor who solved the impossible equation, the mind lost to grief and sacrifice, had returned to illuminate the truth of genius, of perseverance, of human dignity. Finally, Thomas turned to Cassandra, his eyes holding the quiet intensity that had drawn her attention from the first night she had glimpsed him at the board. "Cassandra," he said, voice steady but soft, "this equation was never about pride or competition. It was about being seen. And for the first time in years, I am seen, not as a janitor, not as an afterthought, but as someone who still matters. And I hope you can see that too, not just in me, but in yourself." Cassandra's breath caught. The years of cold perfection, the relentless pursuit of recognition, the fear of appearing weak, they all collided inside her. She realized, in a clarity both terrifying and liberating, that she had spent decades building walls around her brilliance to protect herself from vulnerability. And now those walls had crumbled, not by critique, not by defeat, but by someone who had chosen courage over hiding, humanity over pretense. For the first time, she felt something she had almost forgotten, humility. She approached him cautiously, each step a negotiation between pride and awe. "Thomas," she whispered, voice trembling, "you've done what I thought impossible. And you've reminded me what it means to be human in all of this." He smiled, a quiet, restrained smile that carried both warmth and recognition. "I know," he said simply. "I've spent 5 years learning to see again. Maybe now we both can." The dean arrived then, face pale but animated, accompanied by administrators and journalists who had caught wind of the viral story spreading across the academic world. "Mr. Keene," he said, voice urgent, "we need to discuss a position for you. The university wants you leading research. Resources, respect, the works. And, it's long overdue." Thomas shook his head gently, glancing at Cassandra. "I'm not ready for all of that. Not yet. I need to rebuild, not just in the public eye, but in myself. But I do want to work with her. Side by side, as equals. That's all I ask." Cassandra's lips parted in a quiet, unguarded smile. "Then we rebuild together," she said. "No hierarchy. No pride. Just, us, and the work. As equals." The audience, sensing the resolution, erupted in applause, but Thomas and Cassandra stood in the center, a different kind of triumph surrounding them, recognition not for ego, but for courage, for authenticity, for reclaiming the humanity that brilliance alone cannot define. Weeks later, Thomas formally accepted a position at the university, but insisted on continuing janitorial duties for an hour each day, quietly reminding himself and everyone else that every person, every life, mattered equally. Cassandra, transformed not by defeat but by insight, began teaching with a newfound warmth, her lectures infused with empathy and humility. And though the equation that had brought them together remained published and celebrated, the real proof, the proof of connection, of understanding, of human brilliance paired with compassion, was written not on blackboards or in journals, but in the space between them, in the way they collaborated, respected, and finally saw one another. In the quiet of the abandoned seminar room, chalk in hand, hearts aligned, they solved together not just mathematical mysteries, but the most elusive equation of all: how to balance intellect with humanity, brilliance with empathy, and ambition with love.